Hey everybody, it's Mike here from the WeWrench shop, and welcome. In episode 21, we are going to measure and evaluate the cylinder block for the extent of wear that has occurred over the life of this vehicle. Keep in mind, this block is completely original from 1992 and has 260,000 miles on it. We're also going to measure before and after installing a torque plate, see whether or not they are even required, and then I'm going to correct taper and out of round myself with a rigid hone. But before we get down to business, if you think this video is informative, then support the channel. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment. After giving the bores a thorough cleaning, I want to quickly prep the deck surface before we begin. To do this, I'm using an air-powered right-angle grinder with a 3M yellow bristle disc. Now, I know what you're thinking, you can't sand the block. Well, this disc is extremely gentle on cast iron surfaces. It does not remove metal, only dirt and leftover pieces of gasket will come off. But you should still exercise caution when using it. Keep the tool moving and use minimal speed on the tool when possible. As an engine wears, funny things begin to happen inside. The cylinders do not wear evenly. First thing that happens is they become oval-shaped or out of round. This occurs due to the angle of the connecting rod when the piston travels downward on the power stroke, and some of the power of combustion gets converted into side thrust, so one side of the bore will end up wearing faster than the other. The other dynamic that occurs is called taper. Again, during the power stroke, the explosion that occurs is the most intense when the piston is at the top. And as it travels downward, the energy dissipates. This causes more wear at the top of the bore than the bottom of the bore, and it becomes cone-shaped. To get a visual on what I just described, I ran my rigid hone through the cylinder to break the glaze and expose the low spots. What you see here is this streak towards the top of the bore on the thrust side. That measurement is about 0.04 of an inch wear on every single cylinder just in that spot, and that's very typical because of the dynamics I described previously. But the rest of the cylinders show very little wear in the remainder of the bore. With my calibrated dial bore gauge, I'm going to measure the cylinders in 6 different spots, top, middle, and bottom of the bore. First set of measurements are parallel to the crankshaft, second are perpendicular to the crankshaft and will show the increased wear on the thrust side. The factory bore size is 3.6771 inches, and all the measurements shown are a deviation from that baseline in 0.010 of an inch resolution. So here's what cylinder 1 looks like. We have very minimal wear on the crank angle, and generally speaking, very little wear on the thrust side except for that top part. We basically have about 0.003 to 0.004 of an inch of taper and out of round in each cylinder. Now, factory specifications are very tight. 0.2 out of round and 0.4 taper are the maximum. Let's go through cylinders 2 through 6. We have the same pattern occurring with the high degree of wear at the top of the thrust angle. The numbers differ from cylinder to cylinder because how coolant flows through the engine. Some cylinders are cooler than others, and that's what causes it. Something interesting happened on cylinder 6 though. On the crank angle, the measurement was over the baseline by 0.11. This could be a measuring error or it could be a manufacturing variance from the factory. BMW states that there can be a 0.4 positive deviation from the baseline. This is a little more than that, which is strange. What it means is that I have to take 0.004 of an inch off of these cylinders to correct the taper and the out of round. The stock pistons measure 3.6751 at the skirt, and with a new bore of 3.6811, my piston-to-wall clearance will be 0.006, and that is the maximum allowed by the manufacturer. So I had a custom set of JE pistons made to match a 0.004 of an inch overbore. What's interesting about these is that they recommend a piston-to-wall clearance of 3 5/10, which is higher than the factory. I assume it's because the pistons may be made of a different material than the stock ones, but who knows. A torque plate is a piece of metal that supposedly simulates the clamping forces of the cylinder head. The theory is that the head bolts exert pressure on the block and cause the bores to distort somewhat. It takes a tremendous amount of pressure to stretch metal, and being the skeptic that I am, I wanted to take measurements before and after fastening the torque plate, see if these things actually make a difference. Moving through these numbers, you can see in the before and afters that I only get 1/10 deviation in any of the measurements. So for this application, cast iron inline 6 street build, this was $450 down the drain. Some people say it does make a difference on aluminum blocks. I just watched a video of a guy doing it on a Subaru engine. Looks like it made a little bit of a difference. But unless I'm doing some kind of exotic, super high-end build, I will never invest in one of these again. So the plan is to shave 0.04 of an inch of metal off each cylinder bore and bring them back within the factory spec of 0.2 out of round and 0.4 taper. I'm going to do this with a rigid hone and a handheld drill. This is an AMCO Model 500 self-lubricating hone. You can change stones on this tool from 60 grit for maximum material removal all the way up to 400 grit for finer finishing. There are screws and brackets that hold the two stones, and there are also these wiping pads that hold oil so the cylinder stays lubricated. There's also a dial on top of the tool that extends and retracts the stones to a very fine resolution. The instructions say that 4 hash marks will move the stones 1/1000th of an inch, but I don't trust that. I'll use my dial bore gauge to measure my progress. The manufacturer recommends you use a formula to determine what speed the hone should operate at. You take the number 1200 and you divide by the bore size. In our application, that equals 326 RPMs. To be able to control the drill, I've hooked it up to a variac. This device allows you to control the output voltage to the drill and thus regulate the speed. In order to see how fast it's spinning, I'm using a phototachometer to take a measurement while adjusting the variac until I reach the desired RPMs. Before I begin honing, I'm going to measure cylinder 6 in front of you to show you the baseline measurements. We're going to start parallel to the crankshaft. We're at 0.2 at the top of the bore. The mid bore is 0.4 over the baseline, and then the bottom is 1.2 over. Now I'm going to go to the bottom unused portion of the bore, and I see that is showing 0.2. I'm doing that just to make sure my tool is staying close to the calibration point, because we can be certain that the bottom of the bore is true and straight because it's unused. Now we'll go to the thrust side. Remember that there's that area in the very top that's showing 0.04 of an inch wear. I'm not going to measure that because that's the outermost bound of where we will hone to. The top measurement directly below is more important to gauge our progress. That measurement is 1.5 thousandths, mid bore 0.7, and the bottom is 0.4. And I'm going to go down to the unused portion, and that's 1/10, so we know we're good. And now it is time to hone. Here's what my workstation looks like sitting on top of the infamous Matco cart. I have the drill set up with the variac dialed in, plenty of brake clean, rags, paper towels, and a spray bottle full of hone oil. I set this all up next to the engine block so everything is nice and within reach. Alright, so I'm ready to go. The first thing that you want to do is you want to take your hone oil in a spray bottle. Just give the coffee filters a little bit of a spray. We're going to spray inside of the cylinder as well. Really nice coating there. You don't want to, you can hone dry, believe it or not, but you really don't want to. The first step is going to be to take your hone tool and you're going to place it in the cylinder at the smallest dimension. Now we saw that parallel to the crank there was that one spot that was like really, it was like the factory defect, I call it. How it was like over 1/1000th of an inch over, or under I should say, the 93.4 millimeter bore. So what you want to do is you want to take the tool and you want to put it down there, and then you want to turn that knob at the top till you get just enough pressure on the smallest point of the cylinder where that hone stays in there all by itself. All right, you see how it's not going anywhere? See, that hone is just kind of staying in there all on its own. And it's roughly right at that small spot. So now I'm going to take my drill and then I'm going to start it. Okay, here I go. Now right here, I'm getting like a chatter. And that's typical because that dimension is small. So I want to give the cylinder a really nice spray. We're going to go again. All right, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it again. I'm just going to tighten this up. Just a hair so we get some more pressure. You want to go up and down. go a little bit more. Give it a little more oil. Yeah, see? Kind of has that stutter going on. And that's what we want. That stutter is the stones of the hone kind of encountering that high spot. And we're just going to work it until it works it out. Now these are 60 grit stones, so this is the roughest cut we can make. So you have to be careful. And there's going to be intervals where you have to stop. You have to stop, you have to clean the cylinder, and then measure it with the dial bore gauge. The other thing is that when you're oiling, you want to make sure that you get oil all the way up and down the cylinder. Because if you oil just on the top part, the bottom part of the stones won't get any oil and it will not cut evenly. You have to kind of learn to read the tool. And when I say reading, I'm not really so much talking about looking at it, I'm talking about feeling it. The tool will chatter and it will drag. You kind of have to learn to feel that, to see where the high spots and the low spots are in the cylinder. Let's stop and take a look at what it's doing. Those out. Pull the hone out of there. Give it a wipe. See that? Those are 60 grit scratches. Now there's two interesting things to note. You see where the scratching is the heaviest right there? All right, that's that spot that we measured with the dial bore gauge that was smaller than the factory dimension of the bore. The hone cuts away and reveals what's going on in that cylinder. You could see along the top. Now there's a very distinctive ridge line where I cut the ridge. Okay, and then right below it, there's a part that the hone couldn't touch. On the thrust side of the combustion chamber, all the wear occurs right at the top of the cylinder there. So that dimension is really wide compared to the rest of it. You can see it's also kind of happening there too. You see that brownness? Okay, in that first pass, the hone didn't touch that because just those few millimeters on the top are where all the wear occurs when the combustion cycle is happening. The piston is being forced against the wall on the thrust side. So that's why we're not just taking off like 1/1000th of an inch. We have to take 4/1000ths off the cylinders. Let's just keep going. Whenever you start and stop with the hone, I like to just take a paper towel and just kind of get some of the sludge off of the pads here. These pads are brand new, so there's not a lot on there. And then what I want to do is I want to take brake clean and I want to spray the stone. Spray the stones. All right, and then when they dry, take a wire brush and just dress the stones, okay? This is really important. You got to keep these stones clean because what they do is they load with that material that you're cutting off of the engine block. So you got to make sure they stay clean. We're going to center the hone on the smallest side, which is parallel to the crank. We kind of want to center it like mid-bore there because it was about 5/10,000, so we're going to put enough pressure for the hone to stay in there on its own. We will spray it down because before you stick it in, you always lube it up. And then we're going to start again. So the rest of this process is pretty much more of the same. Work the hone, keep it lubed up, and be hyper aware of the feedback that the tool gives you. If it chatters or stutters, that's a very bad sign and it means something is off. You'll know you're making progress when this happens. The tool feels really good and really smooth. And the speed of the tool is uniform, which is what we want. You'll feel no drag at all, and the hone will be running close to the speed of the unloaded drill. Always keep in mind what you're trying to accomplish here. The hone has to cut the smallest dimension first, only until the cylinder is round, and then it has to cut evenly throughout until you reach your final goal. You have to be very consistent and patient in this process because if you start to lose your rhythm, that hone will not cut properly and you'll start chasing measurements or even damage the engine block. I got cylinder 6 to be square, and as you can see, The hone marks are nice and uniform throughout. Cylinder's looking really good. And we are going to take some measurements. We are going to start parallel to the crankshaft, and we are going to make our measurements at 3 points in the cylinder bore. Top of the bore, 3.7 thousandths. Mid bore, 3.7 thousandths. Bottom of the bore, 3.6 thousandths. Now we go to the thrust side top, 3.6 thousandths. Mid bore, 3.7 thousandths. And the bottom of the bore, 3.7 thousandths. That is really, really awesome. I got this very close. So if you remember, the goal was to get it to 4 thousandths of an inch over the factory bore. Right now we are at 3.7 or 3.6 thousandths of an inch. So we have 4 10,000ths to go in order to get to our goal. So at this point in time, we're done with the 60 grit stones on the hone. Now what we're going to do is we're going to switch from the 60 grit stones on the hone to 240 grit stones to give us a finer cut so we can inch our way closer to that final measurement. I changed my stones to 240 grit and put on a fresh set of wipers as well. The process is going to remain the same, but you have to be very careful because you don't want these stones to cut beyond your final measurement. So keep it consistent, keep it lubricated, and after a few passes, I took another 2 or 3 tenths off, and that was squared up. That was squared up with 240. So remember, we started the rough cut. The rough cut was 60 grit. This next pass was 240 to square it up. Now I'm going to do one more pass with 400 grit. And then we go to the flex hone, which has a 600 grit. We want that plateaued finish. So I'm going to set my hone back up with 400 grit stones, and we will make one more pass. Honing with 400 grit is more about putting on a surface finish rather than removing material. You have to look inside the cylinder though to make sure that that finish is even. So after a few passes, here is where we are at. Top of the cylinder, 4. Bottom of the cylinder, about 4. Now we're going to start at the thrust angle. At the top we have 4.1 thousandths, mid bore 4.2 thousandths, and the bottom of the bore we have 4.1 thousandths. Now it's time for the final stage with the flex hone. This tool has these little flexible balls that follow the cylinder profile as opposed to the rigid hone whose stones remain stationary. The flex hone is not intended to remove material. The purpose is to create a crosshatch pattern, which are microscopic valleys throughout the cylinder so it retains oil when the piston rings are bedding in. But these valleys have to be 45 degrees apart from one another. If the angle is too steep, the oil will drain off the walls. If the angle is too shallow, the rings will skip across the bore and not properly seat. If there's no crosshatch at all and the bore is just polished, the rings will skate across the surface and not properly seal or bed. We're going to use a hand drill for this tool as well. We're going to be operating it at a slightly higher RPM. And to get that good crosshatch angle, you have to use a pretty quick stroke speed, but it's a relatively quick process. It only takes between 20 and 45 seconds for it to do its job. First step is to generously lubricate the tool with honing oil and then do the same to the cylinder that you're working in. When you begin honing, it's important that the hone is spinning while it enters and exits the cylinder. It took me about 30 seconds to get the desired pattern. This is what the cylinder looks like before you clean it, and another important tip, you are not supposed to clean the cylinder with solvent. Soap and water only, and if all goes well, there's your crosshatch. Thank you everybody so much for watching. If you found the video to be informative or entertaining, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Check out our website, www.WeWrench.com. Pick up some merch to support the channel. Free shipping in the continental United States on all orders. See you next time.